Let's enjoy it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 100th webinar of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. The number 100 is a very significant milestone for us at the Gerhard Center, and we really wanted to bring special guests and a timely topic. So with us today, we have John Elkington, who coined the term triple bottom line, and he will discuss the past, present, and future of capitalism, value, and wealth with Jed Emerson, another guru who coined the term blended value. Their work underpinned the ESG movement, but they have critical and constructive things to say about ways in which the debate has fragmented into often siloed discussion about purpose, CSR, ESG, impact, circularity, climate, green growth, and the like. It is a time for a great convergence between those different change agendas. And if so, how can we make it happen? John is on the board of the Gerhard Center. He was one of our speakers in the Gerhard Center webinar series in October 28th, 2020. We were very lucky to have him. He's been very influential in some of the speakers, the way, the direction of the center. He's the founder and the chief pollinator at Volans, is one of the founders of the global sustainability movement, an experienced advisor to business, and a highly regarded keynote speaker and contributor from conferences to boards. In 2008, the Evening Standard named John among the 1,000 most influential people in London, described him as a true green business guru and an evangelist for corporate, social, and environmental responsibility long before it was fashionable. In 2009, the CSR International survey of the top 100 CSR leaders placed John fourth after Al Gore, Barack Obama, and the late Anita Roddick of the Body Shop, and alongside Muhammad Yunus of the Grameen Bank. John has addressed over 1,000 conferences around the world. He was faculty member of the World Economic Forum from 2002 to 2008. He has served over 70 boards and advisory boards. He has won numerous awards and is the author of over 20 books. His number 20 book was published in April 2020 and is called Green Swan, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. Without much ado, I'm going to pass to John. John will introduce Jed, and they will invoke in a discussion. And then after that, we will allow for Q&A from the audience. John, the floor is yours.
Ali, thank you very much indeed for your kind welcome. That was much ado in the sense that it was quite a lot of background on somebody who is still trying to work out what he's going to do when he grows up. I don't think Jed is in quite that position, but I also see Jed as a bit of a mutant. And I think he has moved from different realities and different challenges over the decades. And I think he started off as a social entrepreneur in some really gritty, difficult circumstances in San Francisco, worked with one of the early billionaires, American billionaires, to come into the social innovation and social enterprise area. As you said, Ali, then coined the term blended value, and we'll have him explain that in a moment. I think he's been both a thought leader and a profound influence in this space, but he's also a bit of a gadfly, and I've often seen him sort of not get under people's skin so much as just provoke them and really make them think. So hopefully today we'll have a bit of that as well. But I think we've got sufficient time to dig into the evolution of an extraordinary individual and an extraordinary talent in a way, and in this space. So Jed, firstly, immense thanks for agreeing to join us today.
It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, John. I'm looking forward to it greatly.
And you're in New York, and I'm in London, and Cairo is a great world city as well. So let me kick off and say, I mean, you've written a book recently, a couple of years back, which The Purpose of Capital, which is significantly over 300 pages long. So in a way, we're going to do people a service. Some of them, I hope, will go on to read the book. But you've done a lot of work and a lot of thinking in recent times. And so I'm going to start off now, and then we'll go backwards. So in a sense, what are you doing now? And is it what you would have expected to be doing 15 or 20 years ago?
Well, I guess I'd have to say, first off, it's a real pleasure to be with this community. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm looking forward to this dialogue greatly. My experience in the Middle East actually goes back to my undergraduate period when I was a religious studies and sociology major and had the opportunity to travel through parts of the Middle East, in particular in Cairo, just after they had opened the border with Israel back in the late 70s. So, and since that time have been kind of in and out. So I really appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think that I guess I'm one of those people who every 5 to 10 years kind of blows up their career track and finds themselves in another place. And you had referenced my work in community and youth development. I actually started my career in social work and really just wanted to start a nonprofit and change the world. I mean, that was the goal. I was, raised in the 60s and the early 70s. And my father was a minister. My mom was a social worker. I feel like I was kind of bred to go out and, be a part of a change process. And I'm very proud of what I did during that period. I was the founding director of the Larkin Street Youth Center, which works with homeless youth and teen prostitutes in San Francisco's Tenderloin District, which, as you say, is a pretty tough area. And that center today serves hundreds of kids a year, and certainly thousands and thousands since I founded it. But I kind of woke up in my late 20s and realized that I had become not quite embittered, but disappointed, I guess I'd say. And in particular around the way that philanthropy and public dollars move, the way that the nonprofit sector operates, a lot of the thinking in the nonprofit sector about what's possible and how you do business in that community. And I just kind of decided that, at the time I framed it as the way that money moves in the nonprofit sector is by politics, perception, and persuasion, but not performance. And I think that, that's probably more true 30 years ago than it is today. But at the same time, I think that we really are kind of missing the boat in some of that I'm very proud of being a social worker and of the nonprofit sector as a whole. But I also feel like we're only really working with half the toolkit, if you will. And so I began to, I actually didn't know where I wanted to go. I knew I didn't want to be where I was. And so I negotiated a transition for myself. And in the course of that transition, met a financier who you referenced earlier, George Roberts, who's the founding partner of KKR, the private equity group. And interestingly enough, George had kind of come to a similar place, but from a very different journey. And we began a series of discussions around what would it look like to manage philanthropic capital on the basis of finance and business acumen and principles and practices. And what would it mean to invest in nonprofit organizations and to kind of tier capital based on the stage of organizational development. And in the same way that you do in a for-profit space where you have seed and venture and various stages of growth capital, what would it look like to do that work? What would it look like to have metrics and performance measurement, that would be similar to what you had in the for-profit sector, but applied towards social ends? And so I spent a decade running a fund where we took philanthropic capital, invested it in market-facing for-profit small businesses that were providing transitional employment to formerly homeless people and that were owned by nonprofit organizations. And so we were right in the middle of that kind of mess between do well, do good, for-profit, nonprofit, and all that. And so, long story short, I began getting more and more invitations from for-profit investors to work with them on these ideas and these practices. And so that took me into another decade of working in venture, working with some public funds that were looking at how do you assess publicly traded companies on the basis of extra financial elements of consideration, such as social and environmental factors, a host of those kind of things. That then led me to a place where I kind of fell into family office work and decided that families were not bifurcated. Families don't usually come to the table with an idea around, we've got a nonprofit and we have to have a for-profit, we have to have a foundation. They come to the table saying, we have these resources, we have this kind of family experience, we have a legacy of some kind that we want to transmit to next generations within our family. How do we do all those in a responsible way? And then the structures and the strategies and the tactics kind of come after that. And so I found myself working with families that wanted to do something different with their capital in the same way that 20, 30 years earlier, I began to explore. And in particular, I would only work with families that were doing total portfolio management. So using all of their assets to drive value in the world, to view that continuum as philanthropic, near market, and market rate, and that it should be deployed in a coherent way toward a goal of maximizing, optimizing the total value that they have the potential to do. And so to that end, I began doing that work. And about 15 years ago, again, fell into that family office piece and worked as an independent advisor, strategic advisor for a number of years. And finally decided that coming out of the pandemic, I wanted to do something where I could actually be a part of building something that was more institutionally based. And so joined a multifamily office where I'm currently here in Midtown, as you observed when we began.
Explain just, and I'm going to ask you a question after this, but explain, if you would, what a multifamily office is and does for those who might not know.
Sure. When you reach a certain level of wealth, you end up with a lot of moving parts that you have to coordinate. You have to coordinate the simple logistics of managing a family, where you have multiple households, multiple actors, multiple interests within the family. You have a variety of different investment strategies that you're going to be managing for. You're going to have philanthropic activities that you're going to be managing for. You're going to have a concern around how do you educate the next generation around wealth management and fiduciary duty. So there's just a host of different issues that kind of come up. And so what folks do is they create a family office to manage that process and kind of give professional support to that for the family. A multifamily office, as you might assume, is basically when you bring together groups of single family offices in order to gain efficiencies of scale, decrease kind of fee and expense structures, and be able to really learn and leverage across multiple experiences of different families. So that's where I am today.
No, thanks, Jed. And the question, and then I'm going to say something before I allow you to answer the question, but some people talk about money and wealth and capital being neutral. And I think money and wealth and capital often sort of have a gravitational field around them, which is very powerful and can be helpful and distorting. And you mentioned KKR and you mentioned George Roberts. And you know, when I first heard of KKR, it was back in the Nabisco story time when they would do a hostile takeover of a major American company. A book was written about them, the Barbarians at the Gate. If anyone had told me then that now a small company that I'd set up in 1987, Sustainability, would be owned by KKR, I would have jumped out of a window. I mean, it would have seemed, the ultimate failure of, in a sense, our attempt to break out of the capitalist world and go someplace else. I sort of begin to see it a little bit differently now, in the sense that the mainstreaming that we're beginning to see with people like BlackRock and KKR and so on coming into this space, I think, and not just now through philanthropy and family offices, but directly through fund management and so on, I think is positive. But what's the balance in your mind between positive and negative? And do you think capital is ever neutral?
It's just interesting. I hear people struggle with that, and my response is kind of like, well, if it were neutral, then you wouldn't have money laundering. you wouldn't have all these practices that people go through to try to kind of cleanse their wealth through philanthropic activities, if you will. And I think that capital has sources and uses, and capital reflects how it's deployed in the world. In the terms of impact investing, the way we frame it is that all capital and all companies have impact. And so the issue isn't, are you an impact investor? The question is, are you managing that impact with intentionality? Are you managing it to optimize net positive impact? And so that becomes the question and the set of debates. Now, part of what's been interesting to see over these decades is the migration of what used to be very fringe ideas. The things that you were promoting 20 years ago, now people take as a given, that there are different kinds of capital, there are different elements of performance, that you have this triple bottom line kind of frame that you can think about. And I built on that in my own experience and work by saying that the triple bottom line is there, but we really need to reintegrate it. You pull it apart to understand its elements and how it performs, but ultimately value itself is fundamentally whole and non-divisible. And we need to, with that in mind, then understand how did the parts build up to that whole that we're trying to create through our lives' work and through how we show up in the world. And so that becomes really the challenge and the opportunity. And it's a challenge because I think in many ways, this process of the last, well, in some ways, the process of human history, but certainly the process of the last 40 years has been one of what had evolved as capitalism as we know it in the last 40 to 50 years, having to kind of right itself. In the US, at least in the 50s and the 60s, you had the Chicago School that began promoting the idea of shareholder capitalism as the one and only way that we should understand the purpose of capital, which is to optimize financial return to shareholders. And in the business schools, of course, we're taught that the purpose of capital is to seek its highest and best use. And when we use that term, we mean the highest and best financial return for the least amount of risk and liquidity lockup. And that became, the dominant theme within business for the next 3, 4, 5 decades. And what happened, I think, is that, especially in the late 80s and the 90s, you began to see groups of entrepreneurs and asset owners come forward and say, I want to bridge that bifurcation. It's not a question of just make as much money as you possibly can and then use your philanthropy to try to make up for all the bad things you did to make the money to begin with, but rather I want to be more whole. I want to be more integrated in terms of my approach to value creation and understand that the stakeholders of the company, the stakeholders of capital are really employees, communities, ecosystems, the broader, universe of actors in the world. And it's not just about optimizing financial return to shareholders or investors alone. And that opens up a whole nother conversation then to get to what you're talking about.
Well, it's interesting because I think you and I have both been beneficiaries of the new economy, multimillionaires and billionaires who created or helped to create a great deal of additional wealth. But they also brought with them from the new economy era very particular views about what it was possible to do through capitalism. And a lot of it had to do with scaling and replication, sort of concepts that came very directly from the digital world. And you just talked about value being whole and indivisible. So for those people who've been pumping a fair amount of their wealth into this space of social entrepreneurship and social innovation and so on, I would assume that the longer term goal was to have a single set of metrics. And just to hold that thought, because at the same time, we have this whole sort of impact revolution, which is very much part of the same story, but not always exactly the same people. And you've got within that world the impact valuation thread, where one of the companies I work with is Novartis, and they're trying to put a financial value on very many different non-financial aspects of what they're doing. So I think there's been an ambition for the last sort of 20, 30 years for some of the people who've been investing in this space to get this down to a single dashboard and a single sort of integrated set of metrics, which I personally would love to do if we could do it without doing violence to the underlying realities we're dealing with. Do you think it's firstly possible, and secondly, in a realistic timescale, feasible to drive all of this to the point where we can measure in single sets of metrics the value that we're creating, the impacts we're producing, and so on, or not?
So I'll try to keep this concise. In the 90s, we convened what I think, at least for our generation, was the first effort to try to come up with a way to monetize the economic value of social impacts and create a true formula for social return on investment. Mm-hmm. And so, and if you go to the REDF website, redf.org, you can find the SROI documents that we released at the time. And we began promoting that idea that you could in fact do this. And a key part of that process was to say, look, there are different levels of value within the firm, within the enterprise. And there's things that are kind of purely economic value that you can track and account for in the traditional ways that we do in finance. There are things that are purely social that you cannot track and monetize in traditional kind of economic sense. And then there's the socioeconomic, which is that kind of middle space in between. And so we, in these reports, had a series of kind of calculations about company performance. And then we would try to monetize the economic value of the social impacts. And to do that, we would look at, in our case, we were trying to assess the value of employing formerly homeless people. And so what was the cost that they represented to society at the point of their participation in the program initially? And then over time, how did that cost factor shift based on their transitioning from a cost center to a revenue center, if you will, to be completely crass. You could, it's no surprise. They would represent an expense to public health and wellness systems, the medical system, because of crisis situations that would get them in the emergency room and would have a certain cost to it. They would end up in criminal systems that would have a cost. They would end up in substance abuse programs. I mean, all kinds of things. But over time, as they stabilized and had employment and paid taxes and drew down wages, they transitioned, if you will. And so we created a way to talk about that and to try to track that performance. But then we also kind of wrapped that with a set of qualitative considerations. And so would talk about the social risk of a population, that there's a greater social risk to working with duly diagnosed folks, people who have both mental health and substance abuse issues, than it is dealing with people who are experiencing short-term unemployment. The costs are just fundamentally different. And so we created this, what I thought was a very elegant kind of framework to kind of talk about and describe that, and then to tie that back to the performance of our portfolio of investments as well. And we began rolling that out in the mid-90s. And then the New Economics Foundation in London picked up on some of that work. And they said, this is great, but it doesn't really have a good representation of stakeholder interest and stakeholder voice. And so they kind of wove that into it and their promotion of it. And then it went through various iterations and is now kind of like the foundation of a lot of what's presented in the social value international associations certification work that they do when they certify folks in doing and executing social return on investment work and calculations. I go through all that to say that right out of the gate, people would look at our reports and they would say, well, there's too many moving parts, right? When you would look at the face sheet of the report, it would have all the financial information, but it would also have a written narrative, a short paragraph describing what was the social profile of an employee in this business. What did they look like? What was their background? Who were they in more of a kind of a personal kind of sense? It would have the social beta that I described in terms of risk ratios for the type of population that they represented and how that would affect potential performance. So we had a variety of different things. And what happened was immediately people began saying, well, can we just have one number? Can we just come up with one thing? It would be just like financial return on investment, but we'd strip out all this, hard to measure, hard to assess things. And it would be so much easier. And the problem is, I think there is a very strong seduction in scientific reductionism, that where Einstein used to say we should make things as simple as they can be, but no more. And I think that in the case of this conversation, we've gone over that edge. We try, and the problem is we have this, certainly in Western culture, we have this, we're in love with numerics, and we think that numbers represent true reality as opposed to partial reality. And so once we agree that something is an externality that can't be measured, we put it aside and we focus on only those things that can be measured and brought down to numeracy. And then we get surprised when something that we thought can't be measured comes in from right field and whacks you in the head. And so this is why I would say you used the term non-financial earlier. I never refer to things as non-financial because everything ultimately has materiality on everything else. And so it's less a question of financial, non-financial than financial, extra financial. What are the things that have financial consideration, but are simply outside of our calculus? They're outside of our algorithm. They're outside of our numeric reality that we've constructed to say, here's the value of a company, here's the value of return, here's the value of an investment. We're only tracking those things that fit into our calculus. And so this is where the conversation becomes, on the one hand, more interesting, and on the other hand, more challenging. Because if you're going to scale, if you're going to have markets of exchange, if you're going to have standardization, you can't have variance across the board. You can't have all of these qualifiers as a part of the calculation of performance and value. And so this is where I think, on the one hand, these are great frameworks for us to use, but they're really, to my mind, guardrails as opposed to railroad tracks that take you specifically to a certain place. They tell us that we are moving directionally in the right way, but perhaps we're off by 5, 10, or 15 degrees. And as we all know, if you take that out, 500 miles from where you start, that can be hundreds of miles of difference.
It's interesting. And I think some of our initial interactions were through the World Economic Forum and specifically the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. And the managing director of that foundation was Pamela Hartigan, as you will well remember. And she and I wrote a book, which was published in 2008, The Power of Unreasonable People. And one of the things we did was just look where in the world social innovators, social entrepreneurs were popping up. And Ali earlier on mentioned Muhammad Yunus. That survey I think was ridiculous. I think Professor Yunus and I are on very different scales, but nonetheless, when we did that exercise of looking around the world to see where social enterprise was at its most sort of vibrant and so on, it tended to be places like Brazil, to some degree South Africa. It was certainly true in sort of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. There were places that it was buzzing for a range of different reasons. And my question is in terms of your blended value concept, and you mentioned total portfolio management, which again, I think was one of your concepts. Have you been disappointed or elated by the way in which these concepts have sort of gone out and influenced the wider world? I mean, if I had to answer the same question in the triple bottom line, I said it depends on the day, and it depends on what I'm doing at the time. But I think words and terms do help people think but when they get mainstream, they also get diluted very often. So how are you feeling about your brain children?
I think, so there was a saying centuries ago, the map is not the territory, the word is not the thing. And I think that that's the thing. I think that words are only helpful to the degree to which they add clarity to the conversation. And I think in my case, I don't know that I've added a lot long term, but I think in the short period of like 20, 30 years, these concepts of triple bottom line, blended value, social return on investment, venture philanthropy, I mean, all these things help people put parts together in a different way in order to see a better whole, if you will, on the other side. And I remember when the term impact investing was first introduced, when I heard about it, I missed the meeting where it was coined, or not coined because it had been around for a while, but where it basically a group of people said, we're going to take this term and we're going to get behind it and promote it and really put money into promoting that idea of, quote, impact investing. And when I heard about it after the session, I thought, oh man, this is just a total drag, because now I'm going to have to spend all this time explaining to people what impact investing means, right? And instead, I connected up with the guy who led that initiative, Anthony Bug Levine from the Rockefeller Foundation, and we co-authored the first book on impact investing. And since that time, I've really been able to reposition myself to help promote and advance that. And I am completely unwedded to the term impact investing. Like, as soon as we move to the next level of the conversation, I'm there. And I think in my own work, blended value for me as a construct really liberated me in terms of my understanding of possibility. And it brought me out of this silo of do well or do good, for-profit, nonprofit, and brought me to this place where I really realized that the only thing that matters is our understanding of the nature of the value we try to create in our lives through our organizations, whether nonprofit or for-profit. And once we have clarity on that, then you can see it's a tool and task kind of issue. Like, once you understand the task, then you see the tool that's most effective. But if you don't understand the task, then any tool is going to get you there, right?
Well, it's interesting because when you have a new field, new discipline, new area of science, whatever it is, evolving, some of the early, you mentioned Einstein, some of the early pioneers tend to be slightly unusual characters, and you'd struggle to put a label on them. And I've always resisted other people trying to put labels on me. When I think of you, I think of somebody who is fluid, moving across multiple different disciplines, but also fields of inquiry. So we've discussed the sort of the social work and the social enterprise element of it. You've been an extraordinary provocateur, and you played in rock and roll bands and all sorts of things. But you've also had this academic career where, you know, whether it's Stanford or Harvard or Oxford or now a number of other European universities as well. How confident are you? And here we are being hosted by the American University in Cairo, and thank God in a way for university education. I think many of us in this conversation will be beneficiaries of that. But it very often gets stuck in the past. I mean, there are very traditional views of what it is that a university should teach or not teach. How encouraging do you find what you've seen at close quarters in the academic world? And what sort of bright spots do you see, and what sort of still concerns you about speed of adoption or whatever it might be? Sure.
Well, to the fluidity piece, I think I'm fluid simply because I have really bad boundary definition. And so I have problems staying in my lane, as it were. And I think that my academic career, if we could call it that, is kind of an example of that. I mean, basically, in the 90s, I wrote a lot of early papers and framing around social enterprise and the financing of social ventures. And at the time, there really wasn't a lot out there. You know, there was Greg Dees, who you may remember, had written a lot of that early work, and I had the pleasure of working with him on a lot of that. And there was pieces of work that were coming out of practice. They weren't coming out of academia. And so it was practitioners who were writing papers to each other to try to explain what they're doing and share their knowledge and their information. And when I had my first appointment at Kellogg at Northwestern University, the reason I was asked to come teach a class on social entrepreneurship was because they couldn't find anybody in the business school who would do it, right? And later on, when I went to Harvard, one of my colleagues at the business school said, I was trying to recruit him to work on a research thing with me. And he said, well, I can't really do that yet because I don't have tenure. And I said, well, how does that work? And he said, well, this is viewed as kind of fluff on the side. It's not true academic discipline because it's not tied to what's come before, to your point about, the historical perspective. And it was viewed as a career killer for people to get involved in this stuff. But what happened was, it was the students who really began demanding of faculty that they teach these types of offerings and bring this information forward, because they were aware that this all was kind of bubbling out there and they wanted to really understand what is this about. And so the academy would bring in people like myself as adjunct to teach. And then over time, as you began to get a body of knowledge, as you began to get the underpinnings of theory and connecting that to traditional kind of business practice, as you had people like Michael Porter begin to take an interest in, okay, well, what does strategy mean? And for those of you who don't know, Michael Porter is was the godfather of kind of business strategy, if you will. And he began asking, well, what does this mean for competitiveness in the inner city? And how does that relate to kind of business in the inner city? And that was kind of his on-ramp to ultimately proposing shared value, which he rolled out, I guess, 3 or 4 years after I had been at Harvard and coined the term blended value, because I think there are fundamental truths that we're all kind of discovering as we go forward. And so this is kind of how it gets lifted up.
That's a kindly way of interpreting it, Jed. Keep going.
So I think this is the process. And the thing that's tricky is that we're all, both individually and institutionally, on a path. And we're all you come to the limits of what is known and what you know, and then you have to go beyond. And so this is the opportunity for growth, but it's also, the opportunity for frustration and for sideways movement and for conservative ideas and thinking that hold you back from the progress that you're being pulled toward. And I would argue that ultimately, this is all a conversation about moving from the bifurcated to the whole integrated understanding of value, and that it's like a ship that's trying to right itself. The weight is there, the direction is set, but the angle of trajectory will evolve and change as we move closer and closer to the deeper truths.
And I know you have an allergy at the moment. If you want to really blow your nose hard, please do. You mentioned Michael Porter, and a very impressive brain. I happened to work with him for 9 years. Nestle had a creating shared value advisory council, which was built on his work. And I think what he and Mark Kramer did was very much inspired by what you did as well. And I liked him most of the time, but Michael Porter, also Professor Porter, had quite sharp elbows at times. And there were times when he would say shared value trumps sustainability, it replaces sustainability. And we fought an 18-month battle within Nestle about that. And at the end, Nestle said, all right, instead of just saying shared value, we'll say it's shared value and sustainability, and these things are distinct. I only raise that because very often it seems that in the academic world, there are these very sometimes quite vicious turf fights over little bits of intellectual property and so on. Whereas really what I'd love to see in this space is much more openness, much more generosity of spirit. Now, maybe we're human beings, we can't do that readily, but where in this world of ours do you see people working together in that collegial, properly collegial way? I'm hoping that you do see it someplace.
It's a challenge. It's interesting. I haven't quite thought about it in that way, but I know that part of my passion and enthusiasm and love of this whole space is really rooted in the early days when you couldn't find people to come together around these ideas. So it was a very lonely conference that you literally would know like the 10 people, who were doing this work. And now that it has really kind of gotten legs and traction and everything else, you get a lot of newcomers coming into the space with very mixed motives, and not necessarily, I'm not putting a moral judgment on that. They just have mixed motives for what they're doing and trying to advance. And I think that can be conflicting. The other issue is that we're in a day and age where we tend to lead with our answers. And so we lead with, this is the business strategy, this is the killer app, this is the new structure that's going to deal with poverty, that's going to get us over the climate crisis, it'll be the solution. And so, give me X amount of money and I'll go execute the strategy. And I think that that doesn't lead to co-creation. It doesn't lead to collaboration. Yeah. And what it does is it cuts you off. And so it puts you in a position where you're having to convince other people of the righteousness of your ideas, as opposed to coming together and looking forward and saying, neither of us really has, the patent on truth. And what we need to do is create something new ahead of us that neither of us could see independent of each other. And in the absence of that kind of perspective and commitment, and the other thing is you have to have, in the early days, we had nothing to lose, right? And now, I'm 63, I have nothing to lose. Like I've already got a whole body of work. I got my reputation for better or worse. Some people think I'm great. Some people think I'm an idiot. I mean, it's kind of great. Like, I just don't care, right? And so it frees you at either end. But when you're in the middle and you're trying to build a reputation and promote a certain set of ideas, it's really important that people use a certain language or a term or have a perspective, because that's what you've kind of, hung your hat on and what you really think, matters. And ultimately you realize that in the end, we can all make our best effort, but it will ultimately, may not work. I mean, Gandhi said, whatever you do will be completely insignificant, and it's absolutely critical that you do it. And I think that for each of us, really, we should keep this in mind, because we have to approach all of this process from a place of, Walter Brueggemann referred to it as humbition, where you would have great ambition, but you would execute from a place of humility. And I think that's really what's required, or else we're just contributing to more divisiveness.
I hadn't heard the humbition one. I had heard the Gandhi thought, which I think is absolutely wonderful, and he almost disproved it in a way, because
that's certainly true.
And continuing impact. When you, in a moment, I'm going to start asking for questions, and I think, although I can't see raised hands, at least at the moment, so can I invite people to put their questions into the chat thing, and then I'll draw them out from that. But when you were talking about the early days of a movement, an industry, or whatever, an area of science, and the way in which people did or do convene at that stage, what came to mind was San Francisco, Silicon Valley, at the time of the very early years of the information technology world, the computer industry. And there was the Homebrew Computer Club, where people from what became Apple, what became Sun Microsystems, what became all these different Cisco and all these different companies, work together on a joint project. And maybe it's unrealistic to expect that to continue right the way through the evolution of a sector or an industry, as this thing has sort of become. But at the same time, this is an ethical industry. It does have a moral core in some ways. And I think we've got to sort of continue to work at that question of how do we have people sort of work towards a common goal. And if I were to ask you, what sort of vision of the future, don't ask me the same question, I would stumble, but if you were thinking about where this might go by, say, the late 2030s, 2040, and what in your best hopes, not necessarily your dreams, but what looks at least possible now, what would you see as possible over that sort of 15, almost 20-year time scale?
No, it's a great question. I think that what we will see will be a kind of a continuation of building out of the mainstreaming of these ideas and practices. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm sitting where I am today is that I want to be a part of scaling capital solutions to address social and environmental issues that are already at scale. And we cannot, I think the fringe and the work that we've all done for the last, 30 years, has proven out a number of different ideas and practices and approaches that now are getting traction and have gone into the mainstream. And the challenge is, how do you scale with integrity? How do you scale in the absence of mission drift and being taken aside and asunder from what it is we're all supposed to do? But I think there's a whole set of things that we could project forward will happen in terms of standardization, more products and services in finance that embed kind of social and environmental factors. I mean, there are all these things. That's not really the important part at some level, because I feel that part of what is happening, and part of why over the last probably 3 to 5 years, I've spent so much of my own energy on exploring more of the purpose of capital as opposed to the practice of capitalism, is that I think that we have proven ourselves to be very clever in terms of financial engineering. We know we're very clever in terms of metrics and numeracy and algorithms. But I think the challenge really is, how do we view ourselves as part of this process and system? And impact investing, I think too much is viewed as something we do to other people. How many jobs did we create? How many acres did we set aside? How many things did we do, out in the world? And we remove ourselves from the equation. And I believe in something called mutual impact, which I would understand as being, as we engage in this process, we ourselves become as transformed as those we hope to have impact and transformation upon. And this is really the opportunity that I think that the more we appreciate that opportunity for ourselves, the more whole and fulfilled and healed we will ourselves become in this process. And that, to me, is the promise of community. It's the promise of healing the planet. It's the promise of bringing our whole selves into this, as opposed to viewing it as something separate from ourselves. And that is where we really optimize and become fully kind of present and of greater blended value in the world.
I love that. And when I think about people who have morphed over their lives, I think of people like Mahatma Gandhi. I think of people like Nelson Mandela. There are not a huge number, but there are a considerable number of them if you take the long view. And I just wonder where you've worked with people who've come into this space from very different worlds. You talked about George Roberts, for example. Is it your experience that these people are finding deep purpose in this space, and even if they, you said earlier on that you felt that at the margins perhaps philanthropy could become money laundering? Can you even think of examples of people who perhaps weren't violent money launderers, but people came into this for not necessarily the right reasons, but actually found that in the doing, something in them changed, something evolved? I'd love to believe that that was true. I've seen it in the business world, but I just wonder whether you have too. I
think that, again, we're all on our own kind of path and process. And part of the challenge in that is that it's very hard for each of us to judge other people's depth or their degree of engagement, or much less their personal transformation through time. And so I would say yes. I mean, I know that there are people that I've worked with. I know there are people who I know in my communities of practice who basically have clearly evolved and changed in the same way that I've evolved and changed over 30 years of engaging in this work. And so it is definitely there. And what it looks like, how it manifests, is really a function of each of us and how we show up in the world, and how willing we are to have uncomfortable conversations with ourselves. And because that's really it. Many people are good at having uncomfortable conversations with other folks, where they'll point the finger and they'll be like, "You're not doing this, and you need to do this, and here's the, you have to use this language," and all this kind of stuff. We're much less quick to be self-critical, and to, at the same time that we're critiquing, allow ourselves an ability to heal and evolve and become more of what we seek to be in the world.
I'm going to ask you a question now. I'm not seeing any questions coming in at the moment through the chat, Ali. If there are things that I'm missing, do let me know. But Jed, you know my wife, Elaine. One of the things she's often asked me is, why do I work with so many younger people? And my glib, joking answer is, and she and I have had these difficult conversations going back over 54 years, so we lived through them. But my joking answer is, they're cheaper. That happens to be true, but actually the real reason is that they bring rocket fuel to whatever we're doing. They bring enthusiasm, they bring energy, they bring new thinking, crucially. And while I'm very nervous about my generation saying, look, we tried to change the world, it didn't work. We drove around happily in our sport utility vehicles or whatever it was, but now we're going to hand it over to the younger generation. Good luck. I think that is deadly dangerous. I think the young are going to really have very major challenges to wrestle with. But what's your own experience in dealing with younger people, whether that's in the academic world, in the social innovation space, just the people who pop up on your horizon saying, I read your book to page 364 and I want to talk to the author. What more wisdom can you give me? So what about young people?
Well, I think obviously I greatly enjoy connecting with folks who are 40 years, 50 years younger than I am in this whole process. Because you see parts of yourself and you see parts of yourself, like you see them like doing things that you're like, oh man, like I so remember when I did that and I so regret having done it. And I remember people telling me that I should dial it back, that I was too abrasive, that I was too aggressive in terms of challenging and promoting these ideas. And I imagine that if my 30-year-old self came in contact with my 60-year-old self, I would have to throw myself out of my office, right? Because I was like, wow, I was just so convicted around what it was that needed to happen. And that's what you need if you're creating change. You can't really vacillate. You have to have a conviction. Now, the challenge is, as I said before, you also have to have humility. And that a lot of folks, that's something that comes more with time than with, and experience, and necessarily than with age. And so I would argue that we need both and. Arnold Toynbee, who's a historian who wrote a great book on the evolution of humanity, says that every generation thinks it's the pinnacle of human evolution. And the irony is that they are both right and they're wrong, because their parents were also the pinnacle of human evolution, and their grandparents were also the pinnacle of human evolution. I mean, each generation kind of carries and brings forward what came before and what the promise is of yet to come. And so this is the part that kind of gives you pause. And I think that the trick is, this is why I love reading history and philosophy and religion, is because it's in those places that you find the collective reflection of human experience. And there are very few things about who we are and what we are experiencing. We may have different technology, but humanity has always had new technology kind of evolving. We may have different ways to think about existentialism and the newness of our experience, but these are all things that we've always experienced. And so it's kind of like connecting with the flow of human history can really free you from feeling like it's all on your shoulders. And it becomes a great way for you to connect with humanity, as opposed to feeling like you're responsible for and to humanity as a whole.
Fantastic. And in a moment, I'd love to ask you a question, because in writing your book, you've read more books and bought more books than probably anyone else I know. So the question would be, what surprised you in your reading of all of those books? But Ali, I think you were going to ask a question, and there's another one, a couple more popped up as well. Ali, can I hand over to you to ask your question?
Yes, sure. This is fantastic, and I really like concepts of purpose. I like that you sort of altruism, the goodwill of people, but in the end, you need two things. You need to bring those kind of purpose, altruism to become more of a movement, to become part of a culture. This is one thing. The other thing is that you need to have governance for this. Well, governance means there is a role of a government, the regulations, etc., and there is also a role of a community, civil society in enforcing certain norms. I just want to see where those type of things fits in your view, because you've been very much talking about the mindset of individuals, purpose of individuals, etc. Thank you.
Well, I think that, again, you need both. We need to have organizations that support and affirm the inquiry, but when you institutionalize some of the things that I'm talking about, they can turn very rapidly back on you, and they can become doctrinaire, they can become dogmatic, they can become the antithesis of what it is that we're hoping to achieve and support. And so I think it's tricky. I don't know that there is a regulatory or a public policy platform of purpose. I think that, I struggle myself. I'm asked to do workshops, bring people together for like a weekend to explore purpose and meaning and value. And I struggle with that because it is not something that you can do in a weekend. And it is in some sense a lifetime calling of exploration and questioning. And in the book, I really talk about the reality that what we need to do is to sit more deeply with the questions. And again, going back to Einstein, he may have said, some people say he never said this, but he may have said that if given an hour to solve the most pressing problem of the day, he would take 55 minutes to think about the question, and then he would spend 5 minutes coming up with the solution, because it would only take him that long if he really had thought it through effectively. And I think this is part of our problem in today's society, is that we want the easy answer. We want the single digit answer response. We want a 20-second video clip that we can promote and say, this is what reality is. And the fact is, it is so much more complicated and actually more simple than any of those would have us believe. So I think this is part of the challenge of doing the work. And it's the opportunity, because it is individual work that takes place within community. And so this is where, having organizations with governance structures that support and affirm both individual and collective inquiry and journey and questioning, I think is really what we should be striving toward.
Thank you, Ali, for the question, and thank you, Jed, for the answer. We've got about 10 minutes to run, and there are two questions that I think were quite striking in the chat. One was around the link between equity and sustainability, and the other one was around the links between gender and equity. It's very often the case that business people who come into the impact or sustainability space or whatever choose to overlook the equity side of all of this, whether it's gender or whatever. Where do you think it fits, Jed? And to what extent does your blended value thinking and what's come since then address the question of how, as a species, here we are, three older men discussing these sort of grand issues of our day. It should be a more diverse panel, that's clear. But to what extent have you covered this, and to what extent do you think you have any sort of answer?
Well, again, I think that it's not for me to raise the answers. It's for me to kind of try to support and affirm folks who can speak from lived experience. And, it's a question of step up, step back, where I think, those of us who have the mic need to shut up more and allow other folks who haven't had the mic an opportunity to speak more fully. And they are speaking, and it's a question more of providing support for their voice to be heard in the way, given the power structures, given everything else. The other thing I'd say is that these are all connected. They're all, in the phrase intersectional. And so, for example, when we're looking at investment practices and theories of change, we look at a thematic area like environmental issues, but then we look at the crosscut of gender and race and how they show up within that thematic of environment. And we look for leaders, organizations, stakeholders who represent that diversity of experience and what's happening in community and in ecosystems in order to kind of advance what are going to be the answers that will not solve those issues, because it's too much to put all that on the weight of any of these folks, as much as the opportunity to say they're creating responses and solutions that can then be lifted up and transmitted to others and supported. And so I think that integrating kind of gender frames, I guess you would say, so you're looking through the lens of these considerations is important. But also not thinking that as a 60-something-year-old white man, I can understand or speak to that, but rather support, affirm, and bring resources to those folks who are advancing those experiments, those solutions, those emerging answers is really where we need to be at.
It's interesting because this year, as you know, COP27, the next climate summit, will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And so Egypt will be very much in the spotlight. And one of the things that struck me, I don't normally go to those things, but I did go to COP26 in Glasgow last year because it was nearby and there was a buzz around it and so on. But one of the sessions I attended was meant to demonstrate how young people, we're talking about equity and age and disablement, also disability, all these different things come in, gender and so on. But youth is going to be another element of this, because older people are disadvantaging structurally the younger generations, not just with climate and other ways as well. And this was an attempt to get a company. It happened to be the Body Shop International, not surprisingly, but they had their CEO there and they had their chief sustainability officer. They had 7 or 8 young people being a sort of, in effect, a youth board. Because I've been in this space for a long time, I was rather disappointed about the level of the engagement. And I felt really the younger people should have been better prepared for what they were doing. But are you seeing innovative, interesting, creative, potentially effective ways of engaging some of the disengaged or marginalized communities that don't have this fundamental problem, which is that there is a capture process that go in. You have people who are representative in some way of a disadvantaged group. You bring them in, and then you just turn them into another version of yourself.
No, I remember when I started as a peer tutor in Spanish Harlem when I was 11 years old, and ran a whole track within the youth and community development space. And I remember as a teenager how really pissed off I would be, because the only place that grownups would let us play was on youth issues. And as soon as we wanted to get talking about anything outside of youth, they were like, well, you don't have the experience, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the knowledge. I would actually argue that this is all happening. I don't think it's a question of people our generation inviting folks into the table. I mean, the action, the insight, the innovation is already being deployed by people in their teens and 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And it's really up to us to try to catch up and understand what they're seeing, how they're understanding the possibility set, the solution set, and how they're thinking of things. And then how can we slot in behind them to support and affirm, but not lead or influence necessarily, because they have to, it's like muscles. They have to do this. They have to train. They have to develop this, and they will do that. I have every confidence, and we've already seen that in so many ways.
Thank you, Jed. And we just have what I will probably take as the last question, which is it's set in the context of having enjoyed your contributions. So thank you very much for those. But in a context of massive turbulence, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the conflict in Ukraine, whether it's the tension between the United States and China, and there are so many things that are sort of unraveling at the moment. And the question, if I understand it, is almost a sort of an either-or thing. Who is the driving force in making a positive impact on society? Multinationals, entrepreneurs, or governing systems? I suspect you're going to say both and, but what would your response be? I mean, let's slightly rephrase it. Where do you see the greatest hope of real structural change coming from over time?
You know, again, I don't want to sound like I'm begging the question, but I think it's the wrong lens.
Okay.
I think that social change begins at home, and it can happen. You get structural change as you have more and more individuals who reach a state of dissatisfaction and see possibilities, and then begin to move and push. And so I think this is all a question of systems change. And how do we understand the interlocking nature of those systems and how we influence those from policy and capital and regulatory and other perspectives? But none of that gets driven by people in the absence of individual consciousness and evolution and passion and development. And people need to, each of us as individuals, see the possibilities and believe in our own capacity to be everything that we aspire to, and to enter, to be present as we want to be in the future. And I think this is the trick, right? Is that you're always in this back and forth about kind of the process of both being and becoming, and that tension that leads to the creativity, that leads to this dissatisfaction, that leads to the passion of purpose that pulls you forward, right? And so the changes will come, you know, that we know that nothing is constant but change. So the issue really is for each of us individually and for the lives that we touch, how are we connecting? How are we lifting our community? How are we renewing ourselves to be constant forces for positive change within whatever systems we see ourselves present in?
I love that, and you ended with the word present. You touched earlier on about being present in the future, and I think one of the things that worries me at the moment is younger people are present in the future more than their older family members or colleagues or whatever. But that question of how you get people to feel that they have some degree of ownership in a future, whether it's better or whatever it is, it is, I think, quite taxing. One of the ways that I get at it is through reading science fiction. And one of the things that's been really striking in the last 5, 6, 7 years is the way in which the best science fiction is now coming into this space and starting to play with some of these big social, environmental, political, governance, ethical themes. Not that it always hasn't done that to some degree, but Jed, you're an immense inspiration, not just for me, but for a wider world. Thank you immensely for all the work that you've done to date and what you will do in future. I mean, I really do recommend the book, The Purpose of Capital. I wish we'd had.
And actually, but I gotta say, it's free. You know, we've been talking about it. You can get it at purposeofcapital.org, and you can download different digital versions. There's a reader's guide and there's a music video. So, and all that is free, as well as teaching notes if you want to try to teach off of the book as well. So that's all just kind of part of the gift economy.
And that really addresses that sort of contrast, the sharp-elbowed approach to life, which is the notion of the sharing economy, of generosity, and so on. And I think that I've always been struck by that aspect of your character, Jed. So immense thanks, Ali. I will hand back to you, but I just wanted to thank both of you for this conversation, which I've enjoyed immensely. And Jed, I can't wait to catch up next time you're in London or vice versa. So Ali, back to you, if I may.
Well, and next time, Ali, we can do the conversation in reverse, because I would love to put many of these same questions to John and hear his reflections as well.
My pleasure. We can easily do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. It's been really very mind-opening discussion, and it raised many more questions to most of us. And it's really a worthy discussion for the 100th webinar of the Gerhard Center. So thank you, Jed. Thank you, John. And yes, we give us few months and we'll do it in reverse.
and then you next, Ali. And happy 100th birthday.
Sure. if we live to that. Yeah. Appreciate your time, both of you. Thanks again.
Thanks you both very much.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thank you for participants for staying for a little bit beyond the hour. Thank you.
Appreciate it.